Okay, last video lecture here for Chapter 18. We're going to talk about a few more homeostatic imbalances and some aspects of fetal development of the heart and some defects that can occur. All right, a couple of homeostatic imbalances here. Some terminology you guys should be familiar with: tachycardia and bradycardia. Tachycardia means that the heart rate is too fast, and it's generally greater than 100 beats per minute in an adult. And if it becomes persistent, it could lead to fibrillation, where you have those weak, very frequent contractions of the heart chamber. So that's tachycardia, high heart rate. Bradycardia is slow heart rate, lower than 60 beats per minute. And that is if you are a normal average adult. If you're somebody who exercises frequently, a heart rate below 60 could certainly be normal for you, because your heart contractility is so much higher, because your heart muscle fibers have hypertrophied and gotten bigger and stronger. That makes up for the slower heart rate. Bradycardia can lead to grossly inadequate blood circulation. Your cardiac output will be too low if heart rate is down. But on the other hand, it could be a desirable type thing if it's due to exercise. All right, congestive heart failure. That's something we hear about all the time. And what is congestive heart failure? Congestive heart failure occurs when your cardiac output, your CO, is so low, the heart is not pumping adequate amounts of blood to meet the demands of your tissues. So that's going to lead to all kinds of problems, organ failure, if it gets serious enough. And this is generally caused by coronary atherosclerosis. That's where you have thickening of the walls of the arteries, hardening of the walls of the arteries, and that's generally due to fatty deposits, as we've talked about before. If these are occurring within one of those larger coronary arteries, the rough edges there can cause a blood clot to form, a thrombus undesirably. That cuts off the blood supply to parts of the walls of the ventricles. If that kills those cells, they don't get replaced. They get replaced with scar tissue, and now your ventricle cannot contract as forcefully as it is as it's supposed to. That's one of the key things that can cause congestive heart failure. Another thing is persistent high blood pressure, because remember, one of the things that affects your cardiac output is what's your blood pressure up here. If the blood pressure in the aorta is higher, the ventricle, the left ventricle, has to contract a lot more forcefully to force open the aortic semilunar valve and get that oxygenated blood up into the aorta. So if you are a person with persistent high blood pressure, that's going to reduce your cardiac output as well and can lead to congestive heart failure. Multiple myocardial infarcts, so those are heart attacks. That's where you have blood clots in the coronary artery that cut off blood supply to the walls of the ventricles. Dilated cardiomyopathy, or DCM, is another thing that can occur. Now, we talked about with preload, when you're filling the ventricles before they contract, if you get a little more blood in there, and the actins and the myosins in your cardiac muscle cells, they separate a little bit, and then they have more room to slide across each other during contraction. They can contract more forcefully. In dilated cardiomyopathy, when you have a weaker heart, and the heart's not pumping blood out forcefully enough, your end systolic volumes are too high, over time the ventricles can get stretched out and the heart enlarges. That's dilated cardiomyopathy. Now, in that case, the opposite type thing can occur. So instead of your actins and your myosins and your cardiac muscle fibers being like this and having extra room to slide across each other, they might get so stretched out in those cardiac muscle cells, they get so elongated that now they can't even make contact with each other as well. And so overstretching over the heart, this overdilation, can actually make your heart wind up, can cause it to beat less strongly. It actually has the opposite effect. That's going to lead to congestive heart failure. This is really a problem over here, especially on the left hand side. The reason it's congestive, and we'll talk more about this in Unit 3, If your left ventricle over here is not pumping blood out into the aorta, then blood is going to back up in the pulmonary circuit over in the lungs. You're not getting that blood, the blood is trying to flow from there into the left atrium and the left ventricle. If you're not pumping that blood out of the left ventricle efficiently, you have this backup of blood in the pulmonary circuit, and so blood fluid, that blood plasma, actually winds up getting forced out due to the pressure. It gets into the little tiny air spaces in the lungs, and that causes congestion. You probably know that if you've ever been around somebody who's experiencing congestive heart failure. They have a lot of fluid on the lungs. That's due to that increased pressure within the pulmonary circuit. Sometimes it gets so bad that you've got to go on a diuretic type drug that helps you pee out more of your body fluid and can help relieve some of that fluid buildup around the lungs. All right, now let's talk about some developmental aspects of the heart. In a fetal heart, there are a couple of features while you're still in the womb that don't exist after birth, or they're supposed to go away very quickly after birth. And both of these features are there in a fetal heart because a fetus, while it's still in the womb, is not breathing. It's not getting its oxygen through the lungs. The oxygen is coming from the mother's placenta, which we'll talk more about when we discuss the reproductive system later during the semester. So you don't need your pulmonary circulation. It's not functional while you're still in the womb and floating around in amniotic fluid. So there are a couple of features in a fetal heart that don't exist or close off pretty quickly after birth. One of them is called the foramen ovale. Or ovale. Foramen, like remember the foramina in your skeletal system, holes? This is an oval-shaped hole between the two atria. And that's because while you're still a fetus, it's fine for blood to flow from between the right and the left atria because you don't have any need for that blood to go through the pulmonary circuit to be oxygenated. Now after birth, that is supposed to close off and become a feature called the fossa ovale. And fossa, remember like the fossa, a fossa in your skeletal system is kind of like a depression. So you do have a remnant of that hole, but it's actually closed off after birth. Then there's another feature called the ductus arteriosus, which is a passageway. Here's your pulmonary trunk, and over here you've got your aorta. There's a little passageway between the two while you're a fetus, and that is called the ductus arteriosus. And again, so it's fine for blood in the aorta to pass into the pulmonary trunk because it does not matter. The oxygenation is not occurring in the lungs, and we're not using the pulmonary circuit for those purposes. After birth, that little passageway there closes off, and it becomes a connective tissue ligament, which is called the ligamentum arteriosus. Okay, so sometimes babies are born and these features don't close off properly. So if the foramen ovale, which is what they're showing you here, there's the right atrium, left atrium, there's an opening there in between the two atria. If that does not close off after birth, that's a condition called patent. It's not patent, it's patent foramen ovale or ovale. If the ductus arteriosus does not close off, which that's what's being shown over here in this diagram. Here's the pulmonary trunk, here's your aorta over here, and it's kind of hard to see right now, but there's the little passageway is right there. That's your ductus arteriosus. If that does not close off after birth, that's called patent ductus arteriosus. So either of those conditions, you're going to wind up with inappropriate mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, and it's going to reduce heart function. The heart is not going to function properly. Patent foramen ovale is usually not a problem unless you have another heart defect, and we'll take a look at some of those on the next slide. Patent ductus arteriosus, on the other hand, can be more of a problem, especially if it's a large opening. You might wind up having blood being forced from the aorta and into the pulmonary trunk, and then you have this inappropriate mixing of that oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. This part of the slide up here is actually an animation, and it's showing you how they can close off in an infant. If you had patent foramen ovale, it can go in with a little probe and insert a plug that closes off that hole. And they're coming in through the inferior vena cava into the right atrium, and then they leave that little balloon-like plug there that opens up and closes off that opening. Okay, a couple of other congenital heart defects. What does congenital mean? This means something that happens with birth. With birth. C-O-N, con, means with. So with the genitals is supposed to be referring to with birth. This one's pretty serious, a ventricular septal defect. So ventricular septum, that's that wall, or interventricular septum, that's the wall between the left and the right ventricle. Sometimes babies are born with a hole there that has not closed off. That's not good, because what happens is the left ventricle contracts more forcefully than the right ventricle, so you have more pressure over here, and it squeezes oxygenated blood over into the right ventricle, and then the right ventricle is going to send that up into the pulmonary trunk. So it's interfering with proper oxygenation of the blood. And there's another congenital defect that occurs in some infants called coarctation of the aorta. And what happens here, so your aorta forms a curve like this, and then it arches around and goes behind the heart and heads down toward the abdomen. And you can have a narrowing right there at the position after the arch of the aorta, where it's going to start descending behind the heart. And now what's that going to do to your afterload? If you remember, afterload pressure within the aorta is one of those things that affects cardiac output. So if the aorta is narrowed at that position, that's going to increase your pressure. You know, just like if you were squeezing a garden hose here, pressure in the hose is going to be higher back up in here. So your afterload's going up, and if you guys remember, higher pressure in the aorta reduces your cardiac output. It's reducing your stroke volume, the amount of blood that can get squeezed out of the left ventricle with each heart contraction. Then there's a really nasty birth defect called tetralogy of Fallot, which includes multiple defects. The pulmonary trunk is too narrow. The pulmonary semilunar valve is stiff and isn't functioning properly. That's stenosis. The right ventricle winds up being hypertrophied, which makes sense because it's having to pump harder to force blood out of the right ventricle and through the pulmonary semilunar valve that is too stiff. It's stenosed, too stiff and not functioning properly. And then to make matters even worse, the aorta actually opens from both ventricles, so both ventricles wind up sending blood into the aorta. So you have a mixture of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood entering the aorta, and then that's what's going to wind up heading out to your tissues, and that's not going to be a good thing because your tissues are not going to receive blood that contains adequate levels of oxygen gas. All right, that was actually the last bit of information on Chapter 18. Please post any questions you may have on the Piazza discussion board, and also be sure you're checking Blackboard for clinical application type questions, and also be sure you're reading discussions about those questions over on Piazza, because that is going to help prepare you for any discussion questions we may have on the Chapter 18 tests. Alrighty, good luck, and let me know if you need any help.